say that I have a certain kind of paternalistic relation to cultural studies. And I must say, that word horrified me. I would hate to think of it in that way because of the kind of gender connotations. I mean, I hope my relation is not paternalistic, but I do have a somewhat possessive relationship to cultural studies, and I do try to speak with some authority about the project. You know, if nothing else, I claim the right of longevity. It's now been 40 years since I've been involved with the project. I think that I have been one of the people, especially in the United States, but in the English-speaking world, who has helped to make the project visible and to help globalize it through the economy of publishing, which, as we all know, is largely kind of American-centric. And I do so because, you know, it has always struck me that there is always the danger of losing the specificity of cultural studies. Cultural studies emerged in Britain, in my case, because that's where I first discovered it, although then I worked with Jim Carrey in the United States and discovered a different version of it. But it's always struck me that part of the context of cultural studies is a kind of socio-political context that it tried to understand. But part of it was also and continues to be an institutional context. For me, cultural studies was always partly a response to the dominant practices of the academy and the dominant practices of knowledge production, which were defined by things like disciplinarity, which were defined by things like claiming universality, right? Or the alternative was complete relativism, right? Which were defined by things like the attempt to assume that you could find a perfect answer, you know, which were defined by things like perhaps either the assumption that theory told you your answer, so if you could just find the right theory, everything would be okay, you know, or by some kind of empiricism, that, you know, if you just studied the world enough. It seemed to me cultural studies was an attempt to find a different way of being an intellectual, a different way of bringing politics into the academy, and a different way of producing knowledge. Right? And for me, that always defined what Raymond Williams called the project. Right? Cultural studies has a project. It for me was, or is, a different way of politicizing knowledge production without giving up the authority and rigor of knowledge production. So Raymond Williams has this line where he says, you know, in the multiplicity of variety of formations of cultural studies, what you have to ask is what's happened to the project. And that's all I've ever been trying to do. Right? And so when I talk about cultural studies, I don't mean it to be judgmental in the sense that I want to say, well, that isn't cultural studies, because I think it's impossible to say that, because cultural studies varies in its formations from one place to another, from one time to another, from one set of objects, you know, where you start the inquiry. I mean, it has a multiplicity of formations, and I am not qualified to say, oh, in Cameroon, this is how you do cultural studies. But what I want to continually say is about the futurity of cultural studies. What will get lost is the project. You know, and that's especially true for me in the European and American universities, with their pressures to disciplinize, their pressures to prove your legitimacy, as it were, as an academic enterprise. And that seems to me to involve giving up the risk that the project entails. Right? The risk of interdisciplinarity, which says, but I can't not ask questions outside my competence. So how do I begin to do that? How do I begin to gain competence, for example, in economics, without becoming an economist? Because I have the same critique of economics that I had of literary criticism. Right? So, but I have to do it. I have to be willing to take the risk that economists are going to tear the shit out of me, you know, and everyone else is going to laugh at me. I have to do it in a way that says, but, you know, what I wrote in the 70s about American culture and politics, it isn't true anymore, right? Because the world has changed, and the theoretical tools that I use there, they don't work anymore either. Right? I have to develop new tools. So when Megan said, a Chinese intellectual had said, we don't have the tools to understand what's going on in China, that resonates with me as a cultural studies person. Not to assume that I already know what theoretical tools will work, not to assume that I already know the political answers. Stuart Hall has a great line where, in a sense, he says that the two great threats to cultural studies are that we either let our politics or our theory let us off the hook. So because you already know what your politics are, you know the end of the story. You haven't even begun to tell it, but you know what the end is going to be. Or, you know your theory, and that's the same as the result. Your theory has already told you what the story you're telling you. I mean, I see no problem with that because I have never said, and I do not believe that cultural studies is the only valid way to be a political intellectual or to be an intellectual. I just think that it is one way. It is a way that has developed around the world in many different places through many different histories, which has built on that kind of dissatisfaction with European kinds of Enlightenment notions of knowledge production, of the nature of the intellectual, of the relation of politics to the intellectual, the organization of knowledge, etc. I have no problems with someone saying, well, I don't do that, and I can say, fine, and your work is very important. There are many people I read and whose work influences me and I think is brilliant work, but I don't know that they're doing cultural studies because, for example, they have a theory. They are Marxists, and whatever the context will be, they will apply capital to this. Now, sometimes their analyses are brilliant, and sometimes I have to appropriate parts of their analysis. But I'm not always sure that Marxist theory is always going to be the best tool, and I have to question my theory. I have to reflect on it, and that's just, for me, part of the peculiarity of cultural studies. I don't want to universalize cultural studies. The object of cultural studies, if you will, is not television or even culture. The object of cultural studies is to understand the context. And so in a very famous line from Stuart when he's talking about policing the crisis, and he says, look, this is not about race. Right? I've never written about race. This is about a context that is race. And if you just studied race, you wouldn't have seen all the complexities of hegemonic struggle, et cetera, et cetera. Now, he doesn't say you can't study or shouldn't study race. He just says, this is a different project. This is a different way of doing it. Now, I think there have to be multiple cultural studies, multiple formations of cultural studies, partly because it depends on the context. I think cultural studies is a form of radical contextualism as a project, but also because I don't believe in the perfect story. I don't believe that that there is a perfect story to be told, and therefore I believe cultural studies has to be collaborative, and I believe it has to be an ongoing conversation. Of multiple stories, some of which are told from the same context. But of course, in the world today, I think it has to be now a global conversation, because it is as important to hear what people from Cameroon understand America to be as it is to understand what Americans understand America to be. Right? So the dialogues of analysis